I'm Claire Donovan, 28 years old, and I never thought I'd have to choose between love and my dignity until I met Nathan Ellington. Coming from a small town just outside Boulder, Colorado, I was raised to believe in hard work, honest love, and building something for yourself, not chasing it in someone else. When I met Nathan, I wasn't looking for anything. I was working as a senior designer at a boutique branding agency in Denver, pouring my heart into campaigns for local nonprofits and small businesses who couldn't afford big names but deserved bold ideas. I loved my job, even if it didn't pay much beyond the rent. I was renting a one-bedroom apartment over a yoga studio and driving a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield, but I was content. I met Nathan at a charity fundraiser I'd designed, branding materials for banners, pamphlets, logo integration for a children's literacy foundation. He wasn't a donor, not at first. He was the son of one. I remember he came up to me while I was adjusting a roll-up banner near the check-in table and said, "That design is stunning. The way the font curls into the shape of the book, it's smart." I blinked, stunned that someone had noticed something that specific. "Thanks. I wasn't sure anyone would get the symbolism." He smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I get a lot of things people miss." He was warm, curious, with eyes that saw you and not just through you. Later, I found out he was Nathan Ellington, son of Madeline and Charles Ellington, a family name whispered in every corner of Denver's high society. Their last name was engraved into brass plaques in hospitals, concert halls, and a few luxury condos I would never be able to afford, even in my most successful years. Nathan didn't act like any of that mattered. He asked questions about my creative process, listened when I talked about community-based design, and didn't flinch when I told him my parents still lived in a rental duplex where the heater broke every February. Our first date was pho at a tiny Vietnamese spot I loved. He didn't complain when his Thai got broth on it. He laughed. "Best first date meal ever," he declared. "No pretense, no show." That was Nathan, at least the version I fell for. Sweet, smart, maybe a little too willing to please, especially when his parents were involved. For the first 6 months, it was just us. Weekend hikes, homemade dinners, Sunday morning bagels, and I didn't meet the family. "They can be intense," he said once, eyes a little too careful. "I want to keep this us safe a little longer." I didn't push, but when I finally did meet them, I understood why. Their home wasn't a house. It was a fortress of legacy, marble floors, sweeping staircases, and antique chandeliers. Madeline Ellington greeted me with a silk blouse, cold eyes, and a compliment that somehow felt like an insult. "What a refreshing look," she said, nodding at my carefully chosen dress. "So brave to wear linen to dinner. Very natural." Charles barely lifted his eyes from his phone. Nathan's brother Adam asked if my parents were the Donovans from Aspen, and when I told him no, he lost interest. That was the first time I felt small next to Nathan. But I told myself it was just an adjustment, that they'd warm up. They didn't. I brushed off the chilly stares, the disinterested questions, the underhanded remarks. Then came the engagement dinner. Nathan proposed in the park where we had our first kiss, with a ring that was simple, beautiful, perfect. I cried, said yes. I was stupidly, recklessly in love. When he told me his parents wanted to host a small family gathering to celebrate our engagement, I spent 3 hours trying to find the right dress, one that said, "I belong here, but I'm still me." When we pulled into the driveway of their estate, I reached for his hand. He squeezed it and said, "Just be yourself." I believed him. The dining room was a long stretch of gleaming oak and crystal. I knew I didn't fit, not in the way they wanted me to, but I smiled, held conversation, ate the tiny slivers of salmon and beet foam, and pretended to laugh at Adam's story about skiing with senators. Then, after dessert, Madeline folded her napkin with the kind of precision that felt planned. "Before we begin wedding planning," she said smoothly, "we'd like to take care of one small item." Charles slid a folder across the table. I looked down and saw a single bold word staring back at me. Prenuptial. "It's standard," Charles said with the tone of a bored CEO. "The Ellington legacy must be protected." I looked at Nathan, waited for him to say something. He didn't. He looked at his plate. I opened the folder. Read the words. No spousal support. No asset claims. No rights to shared property, even if we bought it together. If I had kids, I wouldn't even be guaranteed custody of the family home. It was a document that screamed, "You are temporary, replaceable, disposable." I closed it gently. "I think I should have my lawyer look at this." Madeline smiled like a cat. "Of course, dear, but let's not get too emotional. It's just business." Nathan finally looked at me. "It doesn't change how I feel. It's just a formality." A formality that stripped me of any security, any equity, any respect. I smiled politely. My hands were shaking under the table. "Thank you for dinner," I said, standing slowly. "I think I need some time to think." On the way home, the silence was thick. He tried to explain. I stared out the window. He said he loved me. I wondered if he even knew what love looked like. At home, I placed the folder on the counter and stared at it for hours. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. 3 days later, it was still there, untouched, unwelcome. That's when I called my best friend, Rachel. I needed someone who remembered who I was before love made me doubt it. We met at a cafe. I told her everything. The folder, the silence, the humiliation. She listened. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Claire, if he can't stand up for you now, he won't stand up for you later. Marriage isn't about rings and houses. It's about who's got your back when everyone else turns their back." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I already knew what I had to do. I just didn't know that by the end of the week, everything would change again. I didn't know that I would go from being the girl they looked down on to the one who didn't need any of them at all. 3 days after the engagement dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with the prenup still in front of me, untouched except for a single faint fingerprint smudge on the cover where I'd traced the Ellington family crest with a shaken hand. I hadn't spoken to Nathan since that night. He had texted twice, short messages like, "Just checking in and let me know when you're ready to talk." But I wasn't ready. I wasn't even sure there was anything left to say. I felt like I had been handed a blueprint for my own erasure, like I was being invited to a wedding where my role was not to be a partner, but a placeholder. That morning, I called a lawyer named Gina Alvarez who specialized in family law. I found her through a friend of a friend, and within 5 minutes of walking into her office, I knew she was the kind of person who had built her life refusing to be pushed around. She read the prenup slowly, then closed the folder with a sigh. "Claire," she said, looking at me with calm precision, This is one of the most aggressively lopsided prenups I've seen in a decade. It's designed to strip you of all rights while maintaining the illusion of civility. It's not protection. It's a muzzle. I swallowed hard. What would you do? She tilted her head. If it were me, I'd run. But since it's you and you're still deciding, I'll offer edits that might make it somewhat fair. A sunset clause, basic asset protections, provisions for children if you have any. But even then, if he can't stand up to his parents to make those changes, you'll know your answer. I left her office with a folder full of marked up documents and a headache that felt like it came from my spine. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment Nathan looked down at his plate instead of at me. That was the part I couldn't unsee, not the contract, not Madeline's frostbitten smile, but his silence. 2 days later, I got a call that would change everything. It came from an unfamiliar number, and for a moment I hesitated, thinking it might be someone from the Ellington circle checking in to see if I'd come to my senses. Instead, a calm male voice greeted me. "Ms. Donovan, this is William Lang from Lang and Ferris, LLP. I'm the executor of your late Uncle Thomas's estate." I blinked. "I think you have the wrong Claire Donovan." He chuckled. "You're the daughter of Andrew Donovan, correct?" "Yes, but I barely knew my Uncle Thomas. I met him maybe twice." "That's not uncommon," he said, "but he remembered you. He named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate." I sat down slowly. "What estate?" He cleared his throat. "Mr. Thomas Donovan was a private investor. He passed 6 months ago, and after finalizing a series of settlements and donations, the remainder of his estate has been transferred to a trust in your name." "How much?" I asked, thinking maybe it was a house, a car, some stocks. There was a pause. "Just under $33 million. I dropped the pen I was holding. "I'm sorry, what?" $32,876,000, he repeated. "You're welcome to come to the office to review documents and next steps. We can set up your financial advisors if you don't already have someone." I didn't hear most of what he said after that. My ears were buzzing, my chest hollow, my mind sliding between the disbelief of one life and the reality of another. I was engaged to a man whose family had just tried to make sure I left their world with nothing, and now I had more than enough to walk away and build one of my own. That night, I didn't tell Nathan. I didn't tell anyone except Rachel. She met me at my apartment, barefoot and in pajamas, with a bottle of champagne under one arm and pizza under the other. When I told her what had happened, she blinked. "Wait, you're serious?" 33 million serious. She sat in silence for 5 whole seconds. "Okay, that prenup is going to look hilarious in hindsight." We laughed, but it wasn't joyful. It was sharp, nervous, a little vengeful. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I stared at the ceiling. "I don't know. I loved him. I think I still do. But if he only stands up for me once I have money, then he's not the man I thought he was." "So don't tell him yet," she said simply. "Let's see who he is before you tell him who you've become." Over the next week, I moved quietly. I hired a financial planner named Grace Chan, who helped me understand what I now had: investments, real estate, a stake in a biotech startup, and a series of bonds my uncle had collected like secrets. Grace told me to take my time, to breathe, to let the new reality sink in, but I didn't feel rich. I still lived in the same apartment, still woke up at 6 a.m. to make breakfast and answer emails. The only thing that changed was the way I saw Nathan. When he called again, I answered. We agreed to meet for dinner at the place where we had our third date, a tiny bistro with twinkle lights and no dress code. He looked relieved when he saw me. I've missed you. I nodded. Let's talk. He sighed. I don't want to fight. I just want to move forward. We can do the wedding your way. Skip the prenup. Tell my parents whatever you want. I blinked. Wait, you're serious? He nodded. It doesn't matter anymore. I just want to be with you. Why now? I asked, not angry, just tired. Why suddenly drop everything you swore couldn't be changed? He hesitated. Because I realized you were worth losing them for. But it was too smooth, too sudden. It didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like calculation. I smiled politely and stirred my drink. You know what's funny? I said softly. They were so afraid I'd want their money, and now I have my own. His glass froze halfway to his mouth. What? I leaned in. I inherited $33 million last week from my uncle. I haven't told anyone. You're the first person I've said it to out loud besides Rachel. He blinked. You're joking. I'm not. Claire, this changes everything. Does it? I asked. Or does it just reveal what was always there? He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe, in this moment, I didn't recognize him either. I didn't storm out. I didn't cry. I just stood, picked up my coat, and said quietly, I think we both just learned who we are when the power shifts. That night, I went home alone. The prenup was still on the counter. I smiled at it for the first time and dropped it into the recycling bin. I didn't need to sign away my worth. I had just reclaimed it. The morning after I walked away from Nathan at the restaurant, sunlight poured through my windows like it was trying to remind me the world still turned, still sparkled, still belonged to me even if the person I once imagined spending it with no longer did. There was something oddly freeing in the clarity. I brewed my coffee like usual, but this time I didn't glance at my phone, waiting for an apology that would never come. I didn't check social media for photos of the Ellingtons at some art gala or fundraiser I was no longer expected to attend. Instead, I opened the thick leather folder Grace had given me and began reviewing each page like I was studying the script to a new role I'd been cast in. Only this wasn't a role. It was me. My name. My future. My power. For years, I had made myself small enough to fit inside someone else's narrative. And now that story was mine to rewrite. I spent the next few days immersed in work at the design studio, where I'd been a senior creative for the past 3 years. I didn't tell my coworkers about the inheritance. I didn't tell my boss. I still came in on time, still helped the interns fix their layout problems, still carried my own coffee to the conference room. But something about me had changed, and people could sense it. There was a calm that came from no longer needing permission to exist. On Friday, after a particularly grueling pitch meeting, I found myself sitting across from my boss, Marcus, in his office. He leaned back in his chair, peering at me through his glasses like he was seeing me for the first time. "You're different this week," he said. "More decisive." I smiled. "Maybe I'm just tired of pretending I don't know what I'm worth." He chuckled, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "Then maybe it's time we talked about your future. You've outgrown this place, Claire. And I don't say that as a criticism. I say it because I don't want to lose you. But I know a cage when I see one, even a pretty one." My throat tightened. "What are you saying?" "Start your own thing. I'll back you. Or better yet, let me be your first client." I blinked. "Are you serious?" "I'm very serious. I've watched you pour yourself into other people's visions for years. It's time someone poured into yours." When I got home that night, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed the words, "Donovan Creative." I stared at the font for a long moment before changing it. Not bold enough. I scrolled through until I found something clean but quietly strong. Something that looked like it belonged in a world I'd once thought was off limits. The next day, I called Grace and told her I was ready to begin the transfer process. She guided me through setting up the business, structuring the trust to protect both the company and myself, and introducing me to a network of female founders who had built empires from nothing but an idea and a spine. Meanwhile, I heard nothing from Nathan, not a word, and I didn't reach out either. There was a time when that silence would have gutted me, but now it simply confirmed that I had done the right thing. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't angry, I was just done. A week later, I received an invitation in the mail, thick ivory cardstock with gold lettering and an embossed Ellington family crest. A gala, one of the ones Nathan's mother hosted every year to raise money for education programs. My name was handwritten at the bottom with a note. "We hope to see you there, Claire. It would be a shame to miss such an important evening." I stared at it for a long time. Then I smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you're flattered, the kind you give when the chessboard finally turns in your direction. I called Rachel. "Want to play dress up and make a statement?" She shrieked into the phone. "I thought you'd never ask." On the night of the gala, I wore a midnight blue gown tailored to perfection. Not flashy, not screaming wealth, just undeniable. I wore my hair in a low chignon, simple earrings, and the same shoes I'd worn to the dinner where they tried to make me sign away my worth. I wanted the symbolism. I wanted to show up in the same heels, but with my head 1,000 feet higher. When we arrived at the venue, a restored Art Deco ballroom in the city's historic district, the doorman greeted us by name. As we stepped into the glittering gold foyer, heads turned. It wasn't the dress, it was the presence. People notice when someone walks in not hoping to be seen, but knowing they already belong. Madeline Ellington saw me first. She was speaking with a couple near the bar, wearing a sapphire gown and pearls so large they looked like costume jewelry. Her smile faltered for just a second. Then it returned, tighter. "Claire," she said as I approached. "What a surprise. We weren't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," I replied, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing tray. "But I thought it might be instructive." "Instructive?" Her tone held the edge of a blade wrapped in velvet. "To see how things look when I'm not sitting quietly in the corner," I said lightly, sipping. She studied me, as if trying to find the weakness she used to exploit. But it wasn't there anymore. Across the room, I saw Nathan. He looked good. Tired, maybe, but still handsome in the way men from old money often are well-tailored, confident, practiced. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me. I expected him to turn away. He didn't. He made his way toward me slowly, as if crossing a field filled with landmines. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look surprised," I replied. "I didn't know you were coming." "I didn't know I had to RSVP my existence." He winced. "I deserve that." I nodded. "Probably. I haven't stopped thinking about what you said, about how I didn't fight for you." "Nathan," I said gently, "you didn't just not fight. You stayed silent. And in that silence, you told me everything." He looked down, then back up. "If I told you I made a mistake, if I said I wanted another chance," I shook my head. "Don't. Not because I don't care, but because the version of me you were engaged to no longer exists. And the version of you I loved was never really real." There was nothing left to say. We stood there a moment longer, two people who once imagined forever, now separated by the knowledge of who we truly were. Later that evening, I was introduced to a group of donors, many of whom had heard of Donovan Creative through whispers in the design world. One of them, a woman named Valerie Cook, leaned in and said, "I heard you walked away from the Ellingtons. Must have taken guts." I smiled. "No, it took clarity." As Rachel and I left the gala, the moonlight caught the edge of the invitation card I had tucked in my clutch. I tossed it into a trash bin on the curb and walked into the night with nothing to prove and everything ahead of me. That was the night I realized I hadn't just left a relationship. I had walked into a life of my own making. The first official day of Donovan Creative didn't begin with a ribbon cutting or champagne toast or an Instagrammable office reveal. It began with me sitting cross-legged on the floor of my new workspace, surrounded by boxes of sketch pads, second-hand furniture, and the lingering smell of fresh paint. Rachel walked in carrying 2 coffees and a giant box of pastries. "If we're going to build an empire, we might as well start with carbs." I took a long sip and looked around. The space was small, but the sunlight from the corner windows hit just right, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We worked all day without stopping assembling desks, organizing supplies, finalizing our first client pitch. Marcus had kept his promise and sent over a major project with a nonprofit focused on inner-city education. "They want a full rebrand," he'd said, "and they want someone who actually understands what dignity looks like on a billboard." By the time we closed the office that night, I was exhausted but buzzing. Starting a business wasn't just about chasing freedom. It was about reclaiming every inch of myself I'd given away trying to be enough for someone else's story. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. Our client list grew. I hired 3 more designers. Word spread. People didn't just want good design, they wanted to work with someone who'd said no to the Ellingtons and yes to her own voice. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were nights I sat alone in the office staring at invoices, unsure if I was building something sustainable or just prolonging the crash. But every time I doubted, I'd think of that prenup folder and the version of me who nearly signed away her future just to belong. That woman would never let me quit. One morning, I received a call from a producer at a national business podcast. They wanted to feature me for their series on unexpected entrepreneurs. I almost declined. I wasn't ready to become a symbol. But then I remembered how many women were still out there, folding themselves into smaller shapes just to fit the mold. Maybe they needed to hear this. So I said yes. The interview was honest and raw, and more vulnerable than I expected. I talked about growing up middle class, about the night at the Ellingtons, about how walking away wasn't a power move but a survival one. When it aired, my inbox exploded. Messages from women across the country who had said no to unequal marriages, unfair bosses, unspoken expectations. "I didn't know I could say no until I heard your story," one message read. "That's when I knew this business wasn't just a studio. It was a lighthouse." Not everyone was thrilled. One afternoon, Rachel walked into my office holding a manila envelope. This was hand-delivered. no return address. I opened it to find a letter on Blackwell and Ellington letterhead, a cease and desist. Apparently, someone in the family felt my podcast interview had damaged the Ellington brand. I laughed out loud. Their brand damaged itself. Grace reviewed the letter and assured me there was no legal standing. "Let them rattle their cages," she said. "You're not in the zoo anymore." I never responded. Silence, I'd learned, was sometimes the most expensive statement. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a Women in Business panel in San Francisco. One of the other panelists, a venture capitalist named Tessa Blake, approached me afterward. "I loved your story," she said, "but more importantly, I love your eye. If you ever want to scale, call me." I smiled and took her card, unsure if I'd ever use it, but glad to know doors were opening not because of who I'd almost married, but because of who I'd become. Back in Chicago, Donovan Creative kept growing. We moved into a slightly bigger office. I hired 2 interns from underrepresented backgrounds. I started mentoring girls from my old high school who were interested in creative careers. Each time I looked around the office and saw my team collaborating, laughing, owning their space, I thought about how close I came to giving up on all of this for a seat at someone else's table. I was glad I'd built my own instead. Then, one Friday morning, as I arrived at the studio, I saw a familiar figure waiting outside. Nathan. He looked nervous, a small box in his hands. "Claire," he said, standing awkwardly as I approached. "I didn't come to make a scene. I just wanted to talk." I hesitated, then nodded. We sat on a bench outside the building. "I heard your podcast," he began. "I recognized parts of myself in what you said. The wrong parts." He looked down. "I've been in therapy. My mother hates it, of course, but I needed to understand why I let them speak for me, why I let myself lose you." I watched him, not with anger or longing, but with the kind of distance you feel toward an old photo. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I know it's too late, but I needed to say it." I nodded. "Thank you for saying it. That matters." He handed me the box. "It's the ring. I never had the courage to give it back, but it doesn't belong with me anymore." I took it, surprised by the weight of it, not the metal, the history. "Take care of yourself, Nathan." "You too," he said quietly, and then he walked away. That night, I opened the box and stared at the diamond for a long time. Then I listed it for auction. The proceeds went directly into the Donovan Foundation, the nonprofit branch we had just launched, dedicated to providing creative scholarships to girls in underserved communities. The irony made me smile. The ring, meant to keep me in my place, was now helping others rise. As winter turned to spring, I found myself speaking more often, mentoring more boldly, living more fully. I began seeing someone new. Slowly, carefully. His name was Lucas, a documentary filmmaker who wore threadbare sweaters and made the best risotto I'd ever tasted. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He didn't care about names or legacies or networks. He cared about people. And he listened when I spoke, not because he was calculating my value, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. One evening, as we walked along the lake, he asked, "Do you think you would have started your business if the Ellingtons had accepted you?" I laughed softly. "Honestly, probably not. I would have been too comfortable, too cautious. Sometimes rejection is the clearest invitation to become who you were meant to be." He stopped walking and kissed me gently. "I'm glad they rejected you." I smiled. "Me too." And that was the truth. Every no that once shattered me had carved out space for something bigger, better.